Welcome to the 6th episode of Science, A Peculiar History. The 3rd episode in a 4-part mini-series about Mary Toft. If you listened to the last 2 episodes, you'll have heard about how Mary Toft managed to persuade several people, including one of Britain's highest-ranking physicians, that she was giving birth to dead rabbits, and how she spent 10 days in a boarding house in Leicester Square, surrounded by a crowd, waiting for her to produce another rabbit, before she admitted that the whole thing was a hoax. Nathaniel Saint-André, the personal physician to King George I, had published his account on December the 3rd, just as the hoax was beginning to fall apart, proclaiming proudly that the rabbits were genuine. He had a great deal of egg on his face now. On December the 9th, just 6 days after his triumphant account of his discoveries went to print, and 2 days after Toft has confessed, the Daily Journal printed his retraction. Having contributed in some measure to the belief of an impostor in a narrative lately published by me of an extraordinary delivery of rabbits performed by Mr. Howard, surgeon of Guildford, and having been since instrumental in discovering the fame, so that I am now thoroughly convinced it is a most abominable fraud, I think myself obliged, in strict regard to truth, to acquaint the public thereof. A pamphlet almost immediately came out called The Anatomist Dissected, or The Man Midwife Finally Brought to Bed, being an examination of the conduct of Mr. Saint-André touching the late pretended rabbit-bearer, as it appears from his own narrative. Apparently it was authored by Lemuel Gulliver, surgeon and anatomist to the Kings of Lilliput and Blefuscu, and Fellow of the Academy of Sciences in Balnebarby. It is absolutely adorable. Written in character, in the style of the narrator of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, which had been published on October the 28th, 1726, while John Howard was busy pickling rabbit parts that emerged from his patient. Seriously, this is how it opens. After that long and particular detail of myself, and of my various adventures in so many different and remote parts of the globe, as I have lately entertained the public with, I little thought any private occurrence in so small a spot as the island of Great Britain could have roused my attention, and broke in on that repose in which I hoped to have spent the remains of a declining life. But, small and inconsiderable as it is, I consider it is my own country, the thought of which, together with that inextinguishable thirst after truth and knowledge in regard to myself, and an ardent inclination of communicating it to others, have prevailed upon me once more to be exposed in print, in order to express my abhorrence of a late diabolical imposture, propagated not so much by the knavery of some, as by the ignorance and stupidity of others. I need not say I mean the rabbit affair, with which, for some weeks past, the minds of the people of this island have been so seriously and so surprisingly employed, so as scarce to leave them any leisure for things of a more sublime nature, and of vastly greater consequence and importance. And though I verily believe this to be the real and only cause why the perusal of my travels has been so neglected of late, which by the decay of the sale has sensibly affected a worthy and honest bookseller, yet I declare to the world that my motives for entering the lists against Mr. Saint-André, a person to me wholly unknown and unheard of till I saw his name in the newspapers, upon that unfortunate accident which befell him when he fancied he was poisoned, are that little skill which by my education and experience I have attained in surgery and anatomy, and that great ignorance in both which he has betrayed on this occasion. Now, the part about when Saint Andre fancied he was poisoned is in reference to an incident in 1724, not long after Saint Andre had moved to London, when he claimed he was poisoned while visiting a seedy part of the city in order to treat a woman with a sexually transmitted disease. No potential suspects were ever identified, and the possible motives remain unclear. Many people questioned whether the poisoning had taken place at all. The pseudo-Gulliver proceeds to go right through Saint Andre's narrative, pointing out everywhere where he should have noticed something was wrong. For instance, it's a bit suspicious that just at the very moment the surgeon arrived, Mary Toft happened to be in labour with the 15th rabbit. And why did Howard leave her at that point and stay with Saint Andre until he was called back in? And why did the cat have fish bones in its gut? For example, had a native of the kingdom of Lilliput happened to be in this our island, where the story of the rabbits was first vented at court, and had such a one been dispatched to Guildford in order to enquire into the truth of that matter, upon the first view of those pellets, against which Mr. Saint Andre had no objection, he, with his fine microscopic eyes, would have instantly discovered every particular herb the creature had fed on that meal, and what Mr. Saint Andre calls a dirty-coloured mucus, such as is constantly found in the bowels of all foetus animals, and such as in those that void their excrements in pellets is commonly hard and dry, our Lilliputian would have distinguished to have been nothing but a parcel of mere rabbit's dung, which to him would have appeared as coarse and large as a scavenger's load, fresh taken from a butcher's lay-stall, would do to us. And that which, in the middle of the gut ilium of the cat, Mr. Saint Andre thought was like a very small fish bones, the more quick-sighted little man would have demonstrated to have been nothing more than the bones of a herring, which that creature had devoured a few hours before it was thrust into the vagina of Mary Toft's uterus. Though, as arts are very much improved with us, I question whether a very ordinary magnifying glass, such as children used to divert themselves with, might not have made the discovery as well. The author also expresses sheer incredulity at the weirdness of the rabbit parts that, if you remember earlier, Saint Andre described. Saint Andre's explanation that the rabbits were formed in Mary Toft's fallopian tubes is dismissed very sensibly, because the fallopian tubes are far too small. The whole thing about the rabbits being ripped apart is just dismissed as weird and implausible, which in fairness it is. Lemuel Gulliver thinks Saint Andre, getting carried away with his own ambition, was the innocent, if stupid, victim of a fraud, but claims John Howard was part of the conspiracy, something Mary Toft herself denied, but that makes everything a bit easier to explain. In the first place, I have the charity to believe he has been egregiously imposed upon in relation to the character he has published of Mr. Howard, whom he styles a man of known probity, whereas that name is as notorious at Guildford and the parts adjacent for denoting a whisker as ever mine was at Redriff for establishing a truth. Secondly, it must be considered that the pleasure of being talked of and heard to talk in all companies, public and private, as the very second discoverer, Mr. Howard being indisputably the first, of this extraordinary and preternatural production, must needs swell the mind of a raw practitioner with vanity, and make him run blindfold into a series of absurdities, no one of which at another time would have found any admittance within the bar of his judgment. Cyriacus Aulus, the king's other more sceptical surgeon, had also implicitly implicated Howard on the basis of things like the odd way him and Mary Toft were positioned during the deliveries that Arla's witnessed, and his refusal to allow Arla's to assist with any deliveries after his first unfortunate attempt, which we've already seen could be explained perfectly innocently. Personally, I'm not sure at all about Howard. From Arliss's account, it certainly looks like Howard was in on it, and that's what seems to have stuck in the minds of the general public. But Arliss's only decent evidence is that some of Howard's movements were suspicious, and the way him and the patient sat during deliveries. And the fact that Mary Toft never actually names Howard as a co-conspirator, despite the physicians James Douglas and Richard Manningham and the Justice of the Peace Thomas Clarges managing to persuade her to rat on her own husband and mother-in-law, works very much in his favour. In the confusing first confession, she speculates that Howard might have been putting the rabbits in her vagina, but this is when she's still trying to make out that she didn't actually know the rabbits were being inserted. And in the same confession, she also says, "I was afraid Howard would find out and we would be ruined," which points very strongly towards Howard being a victim rather than a perpetrator of the hoax. It would certainly have been much easier to pull off the hoax if he was involved, but there's no real smoking gun that proves he wasn't just as gullible as Sant-Andre, that he didn't just want to believe so badly he'd fall for absolutely anything. Anyway, the pamphlet finishes like this. "Such is the use I am always determined to make of this my knowledge of the world and mankind, as I will not suffer any upstart pretender, of what profession soever, to monopolize and vend his absurdities within this my native country, without such animadversions as may serve to warn the public against him." So, on the other side, if he happens to have any merit which would shine and be distinguished in other regions of the earth, I shall be ready to do justice in that point also, by letting him know in what part of the world he may be sure to find a proper reward. But I can't conclude without seriously lamenting the great detriment like to accrue to our nation by the stir which has been made about this foul imposture, both by the actors and examiners of it, and that as well in regard to the warreners and poulterers, who complain that the consumption of rabbits within this metropolis is become, by the 2/3, less than it was formerly, as in relation to those obscene and indecent images, which for more than these 9 days last past, beyond all example, have filled the minds and furnished out the conversation of people of all ranks, ages, and conditions. And whether ideas of this nature are fit to be put into the heads of rude boys, boarding school girls, and old maids, I leave every discreet and prudent matron to judge. Obviously Sant-Andre's reputation was ruined. A broadside, drawn as a comic strip of the whole story, has for its last panel Mary Toft being led away to Bridewell, while Sant-Andre, dressed up like a clown in a ludicrously patterned jacket and a silly ruff and hat, sits forlornly on a stool in the middle of the room. The caption, making use of the way Coney was pronounced at the time, before its pronunciation would shift precisely to avoid the vulgar homophone that was so well suited to exactly this preposterous scenario, reads like this: "Strange turn of human life, unhappy Molly is now to Bridewell carried to Mill Dolly. The Cunny Warrens ruined and no more must ferrets hunt there as they did before. Poor Andrew sits upon repenting stool, cursing his fate in being made a fool." Indeed, the reputation of medicine, and of man-midwifery in particular, as a profession had taken a serious blow. Sant-Andre promised to publish a more detailed recantation and exposé, which would apparently be titled "An Account of the Imposture of Mary Toft, the Godliman Woman, with the directions of her pretended deliveries and the several stratagems she employed to effect the fraud." This absolutely did not deter the brutal satirists of the era. There's another extremely sarcastic commentary on his account of the events, taking it apart bit by bit, although disappointingly not written in the voice of Lemuel Gulliver. I much wonder, then, that with all his penetration and sharp-sightedness, he did not discover the pieces of hay, straw, etc., that Mr. Arles and other gentlemen discovered in the faeces of the animals. And it is as strange to me that our author's anatomy should all turn one way, and still in favour of an event that he said himself he has at length, with much ado, found out to be an imposture. There was a ballad that provides a pretty good illustration of the typical themes of most of the Mary Toft satires. And the tune actually is specified for this one, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to sing. There's 17 verses, but you're only getting 5 of them. Monsieur Saint-Andre, that anatomist rare, said that these same rabbits pretty natural were, and faith we must own there is something in that, for the first that came out it did prove a black cat. Derry down, down, hey derry down. Such pangs, such convulsions, such gropings before were never endured by honest woman or whore. For as sure as Saint-Andre was poison not clapped, the bones of a rabbit in her uterus snapped. Derry down, down, hey derry down. The woman, God bless her, a mere simple tool, was more fool than knave, Howard, more knave than fool. But the king knows Saint-Andre to be twice upon oath, a due composition of knave and fool both. Derry down, down, hey derry down. 'Tis monstrous a woman such cheat should pretend, 'tis monstrous to surgeons such cheat should befriend. But the monster of monsters beyond comprehension is that they effected a monstrous pension. Derry down, down, hey derry down. Saint-Andre, Sir Richard, who've made all this bother, what would you not give these rabbits to smother? But since that no rabbits are sold, it is meet that a ballad instead should be sold in the street. Derry down, down, hey derry down. So there we've got the sarcasm about Saint-Andre's investigations, we've got hints at Mary Toft's sexual depravity, all tied up with suspicion about what Saint-Andre was actually doing that time he said he got poisoned. Toft being dismissed as an idiot who couldn't possibly have had any deliberate involvement in the affair, Saint-Andre being mercilessly mocked, and sheer glee at the fact that these eminent physicians have made such idiots of themselves. Basically all the main features of the typical Mary Toft satire. While Saint-Andre was the principal, and probably the most deserving, target of mockery, the more sceptical attitudes of the other physicians involved weren't enough for them to get away with it either. The very fact they'd engaged with the affair at all was enough to make them worthy of being pilloried. Arles had the good fortune that Saint-Andre's account, published shortly before the fraud was exposed, is very clear about how Arles did not believe Mary Toft's rabbit births were genuine at any point, and this meant that he could prove that he didn't fall for it. If Saint-Andre hadn't published when he did, it would have been easier to claim that Arles was simply lying to save face when he claimed after the fraud was exposed that he'd never been convinced. The one of the three main sceptical physicians who was the worst treated was probably Manningham, who had admitted to making a serious effort to investigate before dismissing the whole thing as a fraud. He seems to have been widely believed to have fallen for Toft and Howard's hoax, or even to have been in on the conspiracy himself, which we can see in the last verse of the ballad you just heard, where he's mentioned alongside Saint-Andre. Saint-Andre, Sir Richard, who've made all this bother. All this despite the fact that he'd actually been the one who'd finally managed to make Mary Toft confess with his sinister threat of a very painful experiment. In an engraving titled Cuniculari, which is usually translated as The Men Who Burrow Like Rabbits, subtitled The Wise Men of Godliman in Consultation, by none other than William Hogarth himself, Mary Toft, labelled The Lady in the Straw, is shown in bed at the centre of a sort of mock nativity scene, her head back, screaming in pain, or perhaps pleasure, I think that's left ambiguous on purpose, surrounded by various characters from our story, as well as a litter of live rabbits. This is complete artistic license. There were never any live rabbits actually involved, except the ones that Mary Toft apparently saw that inspired this whole farce to begin with. John Howard, labelled The Guildford Rabbit Man Midwife, stands at the door, being handed a rabbit that he rejects, saying, "It's too big." Again, I'm not sure whether or not he actually was a guilty co-conspirator, rather than someone genuinely taken in by the hoax, although virtually everyone at the time seems convinced he was. Mary Toft's sister-in-law, Margaret, sits beside her, labelled The Nurse or Rabbit Dresser. Saint-André, labelled The Dancing Master or Preternatural Anatomist, in reference to his eclectic career that had ended up with him going into medicine of all things, in which he had at one point been a dance teacher, a profession for which he may well have been far more qualified, does a little dance and exclaims, "A great birth!" Richard Manningham is at the centre of this preposterous scene, delivering a rabbit in an absurd Baroque wig. That's him wearing the wig, not the rabbit. We don't see the rabbit. Looking outward to the room, like everyone else there, clearly more interested in the spectacle he's demonstrating than in the condition of his patient, with his hand extended up into Toft's skirt. He's labelled as an occult philosopher searching into the depth of things, and is shown excitedly exclaiming, "It pouts, it swells, it spreads, it comes!" Dennis Todd argues that he's been conflated with Samuel Molyneux, who was the Prince of Wales's secretary, Saint-André's friend, and an amateur astronomer, who had gone to see Mary Toft way back in Guildford, despite lacking any kind of medical credentials or expertise, and who had indeed been one of the original true Mary Toft Rabbit birth believers. Molyneux is himself a far more deserving subject of this satire than Manningham, and to be fair, he does get plenty. Take as an example a ballad by the poet Alexander Pope, titled The Discovery, or The Squire Turned Ferret. And Pope specified a tune for this one as well, so I'm going to sing again, but only the bit about Molyneux, not all 22 verses, which just tell the story you should know by now anyway from the last 2 episodes. And also remember about the old pronunciation of Coney before it was bowdlerised to prevent exactly the type of pun that we see here. "But hold," said Molly, "first let's try now that her legs are ope, if aught within we may descry by help of telescope. The instrument himself did make, he raised and levelled right, but all about was so opaque it could not aid his sight. On tiptoe then the squire he stood, but first he gave her money, then reached as high as e'er he could, and cried, 'I feel a coney.'" Douglas gets a similar treatment in an anonymous poem entitled "A Shorter and Truer Advertisement by Way of Supplement to What Was Published the 7th Instant, or Dr. Douglas in Ecstasy at Lacey's Bagno, December the 4th, 1726. Again, this is bizarre because Douglas was in actual fact very firmly in the Mary Toft Rabbit birth skeptic camp, just like Manningham, and he'd worked with Manningham on extracting the confession. But here's the poem. With usual shrug and pearl at tip of nose, amongst you all I solemnly depose, there's something curious, make no doubt, ere it be long I'll pull it out. A birth is now at hand, come in without delay. Nay, come, good sirs, this moment in, or I will run away. Unless you all come in and see this wondrous birth, this prodigy, I never more belief shall find among my brethren or womankind. Therefore come in with one consent, for I am in astonishment. I suppose engaging at all was enough to leave someone firmly associated with the affair in the mind of the general public. It was only Arles who really got away with it, and that was only because he was lucky enough with when Saint-André published his short narrative of an extraordinary delivery of rabbits. Nowadays, we'd find the idea that a human could give birth to rabbits to be obviously ludicrous. If somebody said they knew about someone who was giving birth to rabbits, we would assume they were either joking or insane. And if you took their claim seriously enough to actually take the time to investigate, everybody would make fun of you. Maybe that's all that's happening with Douglas and Manningham. People sensible enough not to deserve mockery wouldn't have gone all the way to Guildford in the first place to investigate something they were already certain was a hoax. This would be a bit like what we saw with Alfred Russel Wallace and the Flat Earthers, if you listen to those episodes, and if you haven't, you definitely should, where, even though Wallace very effectively responded to a challenge to prove Earth was round, his reputation suffered from the mere fact that he'd engaged with the Flat Earthers at all. Although in that case none of the media coverage alleged that Wallace actually was a Flat Earther. But then, at the same time, surely the fact that a physician as high-ranking as Saint-André seemed to believe it meant it was worth explicitly debunking, even if they didn't take it seriously themselves. The other interesting thing you can see, particularly in the shorter and truer advertisement, is that with words like this wondrous birth, this prodigy, it's kind of sending up the sort of language people use to talk about so-called monstrous births in popular media. The golden age of those monstrous birth ballads that I talked about in the first episode, that usually describe a baby born with some kind of deformity, with varying degrees of plausibility, and its supposed moral and theological implications, really lasted for a bit more than 100 years, from the second half of the 16th century until the late 17th century. Not long before the Mary Toft incident took place. And in the early 18th century, people were certainly still interested in monstrous births, and they're reported in newspapers and things, and people still paid money to go and stare at disabled people. But they're not one of the main subjects of ballads anymore. These ballads talk of monstrous births as if they're divine punishments for the sins of the child's parents, or as portents warning of the impending apocalypse. The word prodigy, which the shorter and truer advertisement has Douglas using, was a popular one for talking about monstrous births, and has an etymology very similar to monster, coming from the Latin word prodigium, meaning omen or portent. Although by this point it was very much also being used to simply mean something extraordinary, so the shorter and truer advertisement is probably more engendering a vibe of old monstrous birth coverage, rather than actually claiming that James Douglas believed Mary Toft giving birth to rabbits was a sign from God warning of the apocalypse. Such ideas had little place in Newton's clockwork universe, and indeed we actually don't see them anywhere in even Saint-André's credulous account of Mary Toft's rabbit births. Indeed, the explanation is entirely based on the theory of maternal impressions, that is, the idea that the mother's thoughts during pregnancy could have a physical effect on the baby. In this case, Mary Toft saw some rabbits, craved rabbit meat, dreamt about rabbits, and it led to her giving birth to dead rabbits. This is still wrong, but it's much more in keeping with an Enlightenment way of thinking than the Reformation-era idea of monstrous births as direct divine interventions. However, it seems like in that stanza of the shorter and truer advertisement, the author might nonetheless be trying to associate the attitude of the Mary Toft Rabbit birth believers, which the author takes as including Douglas, with those old superstitious beliefs. Next time we're going to talk about another figure, who also appeared in Hogarth's Cuniculari, despite his actual involvement in the Mary Toft affair being minimal, and whose writings, which certainly did reflect something of that older attitude to monstrous births, became closely associated with the incident. Thank you for listening. Come back next time to hear about John Mowbray, who became known as the Sootukin Doctor.